Hi, Vicky. Hi, Monish. Welcome to the MMB recording for Insights and Sounds. Thanks very much for agreeing to come and talk about your fantastic edited collection, which came out last year. It's called, for those of you who don't know it, Stealing Time, Migration, Temporalities and State Violence. And it explores the lived experiences of time and temporalities of people who live across and between borders. And it's really a very powerful exploration of the violence of borders and how this reaches into people's emotions and into their lives. So I wondered whether the easiest way perhaps is to start, Vicky and Monish, with you introducing yourselves and how you came to the topic and maybe how you met.
Well, thanks for having us, and Happy New Year. It's lovely to see you, Bridget. And how we came to the topic, we can start first of all. I'm Vicky Canning. I work at the University of Bristol, and like Monish, I'm engaged in various forms of activism and grassroots interventions in relation to border harms and violence and border criminologies at Oxford, as well as State Watch. Monish, you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll try and remember how we met.
Sure. My name is Monish Bhatia. I'm a lecturer in criminology at Birkbeck, University of London.
Monish and I met probably over 10 years ago now, I think, or at least, at the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control and different things around their prisons, punishment and detention groups. And in particular, some of the discussions around detention, which are consumed by criminology, but actually immigration detention is administrative. So we were really interested in thinking beyond the sort of confines of criminalization or criminality and that problematic conflation of the words crime with anything to do with immigration in this context. So we wanted to develop a little bit more from the context of harm. And so we went from there as well. And we've always sort of bounced back. Monish, for some periods of time, you were working with men who were seeking asylum. I was working with women seeking asylum, and also trans and non-binary people in Sweden and Denmark. So we sort of brought together what each of us couldn't do individually and started to amalgamate that, I think.
Yeah, and so back in 2018, Sarah Turnbull, Gemma Lousley and I organized a two-day event called Borders, Racisms and Harms, with an aim to create a forum that brings academics, lawyers and activists together to discuss how borders and bordering practices produce harm and how we can build a stronger resistance to it. So at the event, myself and Vicky, we had a series of discussions about bureaucratic practices and temporal exclusions and how all of this can be understood as stealing of migrant time and what sort of harm it produces. And we are hugely thankful to Shahram Khosravi for the initial intellectual inspiration and support. Yeah.
So you talked about migrant time, Monish. What's the difference between migrant time and citizen time?
Sure. I think before I get there, I just want to highlight the work, want to highlight the the work that we build on. So because that will in a way address that question that you've just put forward. So in our work, both Vicky and I address the harms inflicted by the immigration regimes. Therefore, it was a no-brainer for us to come together yet once again to develop and further the understanding of state violence. By doing so, we switched the attention on to the criminogenic, conniving and thieving states and ways in which they actively steal migrant time. So Melanie Griffiths, Shahram Khosravi, and previously in 70s, Dan Cohen and Laurie Taylor have shown us how time can be used as a controller rather than resource. For instance, in the context of criminal justice, time can be given as a punishment. Those who are given custodial sentences, their time is abstracted by courts and through sanctioning of prison time. However, there's one thing that differs between confinement by the criminal justice system and confinement by the immigration system, is that in the former confinement is, I would call determinate, right? Which means people are given sentences for a certain period of time. By saying this, I don't intend to suggest that individuals sanctioned do not experience harms or pains of punishment. However, there's one aspect that is different, is that migrants count their time up while in the immigration system, as majority do not know how long they will be held in detention for. So for them, it is an indeterminate or indefinite confinement, not just in detention, but also living in a detainable and deportable condition. Many do not know how long it will take for their cases to be finalized, and they live in the in-between condition and subjected to exclusion and marginalization. So this is where we intellectually intervene. So migrants' time is absolutely controlled by the state. Those who work with migrants or know people seeking asylum will often hear these words: this person has waited for papers for 10 years, 15 years, even 20 years. This person was detained at different periods throughout their migratory journeys, or they are hiding from the authorities to avoid deportation. So in each of these instances, their time is absolutely controlled by the state. And by making people wait, leaving individuals in limbo, confining them inside and outside of detention, states are controlling and stealing a very precious resource called time.
So just to come in there, I mean, the discussions on time as capital go back further, as far as Marx and Engels, really, around who has capital over their own time and how that can be utilized and the structures under which they can't be utilized. And I think Monish and I really felt that a lot of discussions are in the passive, so about stolen time and about, you know, sort of migrant time as the key focus, rather than the structures around this, which oppresses and affects time, and through intersectional ways and mechanisms. So not just as simplistically, of course, we would critique the use of labels such as refugee, asylum seeker, etc. But there are aspects of time which are specific to specific regimes, to specific experiences, and in different places. And these kind of nuances are really important in recognizing how we can draw comparisons to focus on what changes can be made or what interventions can be made, what isn't helpful for people in asylum systems. I'll give as an example, Monish talked about immigration detention centres in Denmark, for example. Deportation and departure centres, as well as asylum centres, they mirror forms of regimes which immigration detention have, and yet they're completely outside of these kinds of formal detention spaces. So it's really about recognizing the complexities and putting that into the active of stealing time. Stealing something is recognizably, if it's somebody with benefits, you know, benefit fraud, if it's somebody, you know, on the street, we know that these are identifiable individuals that are targeted, controlled, and punished for actions. And yet the one thing which we're really clear about from the introduction, the one thing that we can never get back as humans is our time. There is no time machine to take back what's been taken from you. There's nothing else that can replace time whenever it is stolen from you. So we wanted to put this into the active and to be very clear about the context of state and also state corporate harms and violences which are embedded in these asylum regimes, and which we can go on to talk about in the context of particular and specific chapters and interventions. Bridget, which I think you're probably going to ask us next.
Yeah, you're anticipating my questions, but yeah, just to say that I think that, you know, it is a really important intervention, because I think that generally when people, whether they're activists, organisers or academics, thinking, acting, writing about migration and asylum, tend to really focus on space, on movement, and not on time. And also I think you're right that you can't get the time back. And so I think, you know, when people are struggling for 10, 15 years to get their asylum claim heard, and then they win their asylum claim, it's like, yeah, it's been won, which is true, that's great. But actually, there's that time of 15 years can never, ever be got back. That's gone. And I think almost we don't have the words to kind of express what has been taken, which is why I think that, you know, this collection is a really powerful one. I mean, I wonder if you could tell me a bit more about the contributors to the volumes and the kinds of contributions that are made.
Yeah, sure. So we have a very wide variety of contributions in the book. We start off with a chapter by Lisa Schuster, Reza Hosseini, Mona Hosseini, Razia Razai, and Muhammad Riaz Khan Shinwari, who talk about Afghanistan in the context of Afghanistan. It's followed by a chapter by Karam Yahya, who has gone through a lived experience of confinement. And he talks about his migratory journey into Germany, if I'm correct, Vicky. This is followed by a chapter by Isabel Mayer and Georgia Dona, who talk about micropolitics of time and asylum regime in the UK. And then we have a very powerful chapter, once again, by Behrooz Boochani and Omid Tawfiqian on Manus Island, where Behrooz was confined. This is followed by a chapter by Annika Lindberg and Stanley Edward on European deportation regime. There's a chapter by our very own Vicky Cannon on temporal harms. There's a chapters by Ruth Munzo Goldberg and Alexis Silver, which deal with Mexican migrants or Mexican migrants living in the United States. I deal with the Citizenship Amendment Act and National Register of Citizens in India, and how does that impact on those who are rendered illegalized and subsequently stateless because of the National Register of Citizens. And then finally, we have Evgenia, who is dealing with migrants held in the violence continuum in Greece. So a very wide variety of chapters in various jurisdictional contexts addressing the active stealing of time of migrants.
So there was even two more. So we had Melissa Manzanares and Liron Goldring as well. So it's quite a lot of people. But as Monish has just said, what we really wanted to do was to draw together people who are in different temporal contexts, different global contexts, and with different experiences. So we didn't want this to be a book that was confined to authors from academia, for example. So there are people, Behrooz Boochani, who's been subjected to detention in Manus prison. There's Karam Yahya, who talks about his journey from Jordan. Karam's from Syria, and also Stanley Edward, who'd been subjected to detention in Denmark as well. So some people who had not written academically before that we wanted to support into being in what would come to be, in a sense, an academic collection. We'd hoped that it would be in paperback first, but we didn't win that particular battle. But we also wanted it to be, so it starts, as Monish says, it starts almost from the end backward, where it begins in Afghanistan, but with reflections, particularly from women whose partners have left Afghanistan. So this is about waiting and being the sense of being left behind and waiting for someone to come back. So that's I think a very untold story of migration. And also that kind of, there's quite often people who do leave can experience forms of guilt for having left. And I think that comes up on subsequent chapters later on, aspects of regret or longing or missing, all of these important human aspects which are regulated emotions and feelings and being and existing, which is regulated by these bureaucratic borders. And then we've started there, and then it sort of moves through to various different aspects internationally, but also the impacts of these as well as it moves toward the end. So it is kind of a narrative in and of itself. The chapters are all very different. We didn't want to be prescriptive. So we did discuss at the time, Monish, about being much more specific about corporate crime or necropolitics and drawn from Mbemba and all of these things. But actually, we wanted authors to bring their own experiences and their own insights rather than us being prescriptive in that sense. So what we end up with is a narrative which takes us then to thinking about the compounding of trauma, how historic experiences of conflict or violence, sexualized violence or persecution can be made worse in the lives of survivors by bureaucracies, that they are actively impacted upon and negatively affected, not just by previous identifiable forms of violence, but that these become manifested through completely avoidable, mitigatable decisions made by states and corporations. And then, as Monish says, it starts to think about the contemporary and the context, the Indian context that Monish unpacks. And then Evgeny Iliadu's work, which we wanted to really draw as as the final chapter, was to emphasize the lack of respect of migrant and refugee time, human time, even in death. So what Evgeny talks about is the ways in which bodies are left in the sea. States won't take responsibility whenever people die at borders, don't want to take responsibility for collecting people. What happens to families who never hear from family members again and don't know where their loved ones are? And I know that our colleague as well, Bridget Anderson, talks about this with the Missing Migrants projects, etc. So we wanted to draw all of these things together to say that even like through all of these mitigatable things, even in death, we have a two-tier response to the lives and existences of people in this way.
So how have you actually structured the book? You've talked me through the kind of progress. Was it easy to structure the book, in fact, with these kind of huge variety of contributors?
Monish?
No, actually, we found structuring the book one of the most difficult tasks. It required a lot of going back and forth, going in and out of the chapters, and to identify things that could fit them in a single theme. And we found that incredibly difficult, which is one reason why you will see chapters as being numbered rather than being thematized and fitted into a particular theme. Yeah.
It's almost, when you look at it back, Monish, it's almost like it is a linear structure overall. It's almost like a narrative that brings together internationalized recognition. But being able to sort of determine where everything went, and I will say the book was affected, ironically almost, by aspects of time itself. So we started the book in 2018, and it ended with, during this period, there was people who were authors and contributors were having to deal with the bureaucracies themselves. So it's very easy in an academic world to say, oh, actually, I need your chapter edits for this time next Friday. But actually, people are dealing with, there was obviously the Idlib offensive, there was, as the book was coming to an end, the crisis in Afghanistan was obviously increasing since the February 2020 pullout by Trump. Real world politics, real life, the impacts of borders and the impacts of that on time were really affecting every aspect of this. And then came COVID. So just as we were getting toward everything being collated, COVID developed. We started, we recognized, Monish and I, that there was other priorities that people have. I was ill for a period of time, and that obviously impacted on the progress. And, you know, really, it's just, so I'd experienced previously something similar when I edited a book with women seeking asylum, and just the disconnect between, I think academia is going to have to be a lot more responsive and reflective in the time that the impacts of asylum and bureaucracies and internationalized politics can have on people if we're going to be more inclusive going forward, because really it needs to be more flexible, given that people are dealing with real world problems and that these are often unpredictable in the context of international politics. So the answer is no, it was not very easy to get to, but I still think that the authors that have contributed have done phenomenal circumstances, have done phenomenal work even beyond the circumstances, even if these really problematic circumstances weren't arising. I think that they've developed a different way of seeing and thinking around how time is stolen by states and corporations as well, which Behrooz is quite clear to say on his experience in Manus prison.
So if you were going to, you know, having read and edited all of the chapters and thinking about them together rather than separately, what would you say are the key points that can be taken away from the volume? I mean, in a way, you've talked a bit about the work that you built on your ideas when you came into the project. How did those change and develop as a result of going through with this work?
I think that one learning curve is that, or one thing to look at it all collectively, is that rather than pigeonhole experiences into pre-existing, you know, like pre-existing theories of knowledge or approaches or epistemologies, etc., I think it's been really useful to maybe start to think about how epistemological approaches can stem from these. So rather than the other way around, which is often the case in academia, where you build on very specific things. I think that it also shows us the intersectional ways that borders affect in different ways from the offset, even listening to the voices of women who are in Afghanistan, whose potential to leave had they wanted to was still reduced, but also that loss, that longing for people that they would go on to miss as well. You know, in this case, in the case of Afghanistan, predominantly the men that were in their lives, their sons or partners. I think that it gives scope to draw together lived realities with quite complex discussions. I think on state violence. Violence is, of course, a huge subject, and trying to draw on state violence. I mean, what is the state? And you can even see through the chapters, there is not one monolithic state or even an interpretation of a monolithic state. So I think, I mean, even while I was doing my PhD, you know, that was a long time ago now, but even then I've always been an advocate of bricolage approaches to knowledge, not just one very dominant approach. And this, I think that reading these collectively does that very well. It draws together very complex differences, but in ways where we can knit together interesting and important narratives that I think otherwise can be unseen or not critically addressed in academia. And it's been a privilege to work with these, you know, awesome people like who are doing this work, and not just doing the work, but also, as I think it's always important, you know, one form of resistance is surviving these regimes, and subsequently to survive these regimes and be able to come across, you know, to develop such insightful ways, some of which is actually, you know, quite poetic ways of conveying this knowledge, information and experience, is really, I think, is really important.
And there's one crucial point that I wanted to raise was resistance. I mean, writing is a form of resistance, and the way Behrooz and Karam and all the other contributors speak and write and analyze about lived experiences is incredibly powerful in the book. And I think through that in itself, they are posing a challenge to the thieving states. And I think this is where the key strength of the book actually lies.
And just to add on that, just because you mentioned, so Behrouz is also a poet and a journalist. Karam, one part, so just to sort of bring the, the humor and, bring to life some of the chapters, one thing that really still makes me almost laugh out loud in its irony is a line that Karam says because he had very, outlines very difficult movements through on boats, by walking, through Serbia, etc. And says, the last form of transport that I was looking for is spaceship. And, you just do kind of think, it makes me think, actually, I can't think of any other form of transport that you could use except ship. So, I think that it's really important to use different ways of writing, different ways of talking about stuff that gets across these discussions in ways that aren't just as simplistically complex sometimes as academia can be.
Thanks very much, Vicky and Monish. I'd really encourage everyone to go out and buy the book or read it in the library. It's published by Palgrave, and there will be a connection to the webpage where you can buy the book on the MMB website. Thanks very much, both. That was really fascinating and very important. Thank you for the work that you've been doing on it.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks for having us.